Today on Denver Hot Rods, Kevin and Tom get their cars together for the Hot Rod Dirt Drags. Then, Denver legend Neal East talks about the Ford Flathead, and Colorado racing legend Pete Stringer shows you how to install a piston in a Flathead. Then, local pinstriper Tim Graham stripes a 39 Ford. And on Hot Rod Builds, we show you how to do a kickup on a Model A frame. In North Denver, Matt, Tom, and Kevin have been working on Kevin's 5-window coupe, getting it ready for the dirt drags.
Kevin Lowen got a 33 Ford 5-window firing for the first time.
It comes back.
About 2 years in process. Proud papa at this point.
But yeah, if you just bend that a little bit.
It's a good idea. I should just do that more.
Yeah.
I've wanted a 33, 34 Ford since I was a kid. Started going to the dirt drags and got the itch to do something earlier again. Was at the dirt drags and talking with Joe and Dusty, and they mentioned that they had a couple of cars that they might be interested in selling. Went up and saw them and saw this body sitting on a frame that I didn't really love, that had been sort of hacked up in the 80s. Within a couple of weeks, I'd found another complete chassis with a 21 stud motor, transmission, full suspension. Cut a deal to buy both of them and started work.
Stuff.
The Ford Flathead has been with us since 1932. Denver hot rod legend Neal East gives us his thoughts on this historic engine.
When the 32 V8 came out, it had its problems, but it was the first mass-produced, low-price car with that kind of an engine. Probably one of the biggest portions of it was the availability. The engine was put in millions of cars and performed well for what it was, and the other nice thing about it was that it was very amenable to modifying. Guys that wanted to work on those engines began to port and relieve them and bore them. And as you know, the parts people got into the act, and all these aftermarket people started making heads and manifolds, and so there was equipment available. We used to pay $50 for a block, you know, a good block. And you could find good blocks for $50.
Pete starts by squeezing together the piston rings in a vise with a piston ring compressor. Then he slips the piston and rod assembly into the bore, lining up the connecting rod with the journal on the crank. Then he gently taps the piston assembly into place while compressing the rings. Sometimes the rings hang up in the bore, so you have to be careful. Then, Pete knocks the piston down until the rod end touches the crank. Then he tightens up the connecting rod end and later will torque it down. Pinstriping has been around for decades, with names like Von Dutch, Ed Big Daddy Roth, and Dean Jeffries synonymous with the art form. In Denver, Tim Graham carries on the tradition. First, he wipes down the area to be striped with mineral spirits. Then, he marks a center line with a grease pen. Then he sets up the white one-shot paint on an old magazine. Now, using a 000 brush, he lays down the stripe. In Aurora, Colorado, Tom and Matt are also working on Tom's 27 Model T Roadster, getting it ready for the dirt drags, after Tom broke the Lincoln Zephyr gears in his '39 Ford transmission.
I was on Federal Boulevard and coming to a stoplight, and the light changed just as I was coming to a stop, and I hit a big bump which kind of knocked it out of gear, and I'm still moving, and so I stepped on the clutch and tried to get the shifter into first gear, and apparently the transmission was rotating too fast, and I chipped a tooth off at least one tooth off the first gear, and that got caught in the transmission and kind of locked it up.
So when we were putting the motor and transmission back in, we had Matt and Tom Fletcher and Clint. It was Clint that gave me a transmission case that I put together, because my transmission case had one of the thrust bearing surfaces was pretty galled, and I think accounted for why the transmission was dropping out of gear so frequently.
You awake, Mr. Fletcher?
But anyway, they were all there to give me a hand. It's kind of a difficult proposition to drop the whole engine and transmission in and get the universal joint lined up on the torque tube. But we had a little method where I put a piece of wire around it and held up the end of the universal joint, and had it clocked so we could just, push that transmission into it and button everything up, and it all worked out. I was glad I had a number of people giving me a hand on that day. That was a lot of fun. Be fine.
You good, Clint? Yep. Everybody happy?
Now that Tom is happy with his engine installation, it's time for Hot Rod Builds. A stock Model A sits kind of high. A kickup or stepping of the rear cross member will lower the stance. After cutting the frame rails 4 inches from the face of the cross member, clean the edges to be welded. Then, position the cross member lining up the bottom of the frame rail with the top of the frame rail. Clamp together and measure across for square using factory mounting holes as guides. Then, tack weld into place. Now we need to cut reinforcing plates out of raw steel, the same thickness as the frame, which is 1/8 inch or roughly 11 gauge steel. These will strengthen the 2 pieces you just welded together. They join the top inside frame rail and bottom outside frame rail. Using cardboard templates, we made 2 identical boxing plates that will be welded from the frame to the cross member. Using cardboard templates again, we made top and bottom side boxing plates. If you need to, grind down your welding to make it smooth. That completes the bottom of the frame. Flip it over and continue welding boxing plates on top. And this is what your finished frame should look like. It should be 3 inches lower than a stock Model A and achieve that hot rod stance you're looking for.
With the car. Only took me 5 years.
Tom DeJean also made it to the dirt drags.
It was a pretty good day. Had some snow tires from Matt, and I think that helped a bit.
Tom also raced local legend Mike Scaplow.
Mike jumped out to a pretty good lead, and it took me a while to catch him, but I I got past him about a car length before we hit the finish line.
Kevin and Tom finally got to race each other.
Yeah, so racing Tom, we fired the car on a Sunday, which you guys saw earlier. We drove the car for the first time on the street the next Sunday. And the Thursday that followed that, 4 days later, we were at the dirt tracks. I was told to break the engine in the way I was going to drive it. So we're going to do some racing. So by the fourth day on the road, it was at the track for the dirt drags. And we were still struggling with a few things. The generator wasn't charging at all. So we weren't getting much electricity, spark, and the carburetor setup was still a mess at that point. But it ran well. But yeah, I think I might need another run at Tom. I think we might have something for him now that it's dialed in a little bit more.
That's our show for today. Look for Denver Hot Rods on social media. We leave you now with more from the 2019 Hot Rod Dirt Drags in Monte Vista, Colorado.
Speed Shop Methods.